I thank the gentleman for yielding. The ranking member said this was a bill to solve a non-existent problem. Everybody ought to pay their taxes. Everybody. Everybody ought to pay their taxes. Now, if you're really rich, you can find an accountant who can find you about every loophole there is that we've given. We don't have a bill on the floor closing loopholes. The chairman admits that federal employees pay their taxes at voluntarily and correctly at a higher percentage than general public. Should every one of them, should it be 100%? The chairman's right. It should be 100%. The gentleman from North Carolina talks about our federal employees and they ought to be treated correctly. We're their board of directors. I will tell you, folks, if any board of directors of any large corporation in America treated its employees the way we treat them, they'd all quit and the company would go bankrupt. Because we treat our federal employees very poorly. Very poorly. And the general public, of course, thinks they're loafing and they're not working hard and this, that, and the other. And that's wrong. We have the best civil service in the world. And this does convey the message that somehow you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And I know the gentleman gets up and says, this is a very small percentage. And when a member of Congress doesn't pay his taxes and he gets indicted and he has to quit this body, it besmirches all of us. The gentleman from Maryland is absolutely correct. Has not been mentioned, but there is a provision in law that allows the IRS to go in and take the salary of federal employees. That's what the gentleman's talking about. Unlike the private sector, where you have to go through a lot of rigmarole, properly so, to protect the taxpayer, the federal employee is subjected to the IRS having special authority to go in and take part of their salary. Now, by the way, this mentions federal employees. I don't know whether the ranking member knows the answer to this, but are members of Congress included in that definition? The answer, the gentleman is shaking his head, saying no. Yet the Congress, as an institution, has a lower rate of paying some 95% as opposed to 97% federal employees. What is this all about? This is about, frankly, saying government is bad and the people who work for it aren't so hot either. Now, I don't think the gentleman from Utah thinks that. I understand that. Gentleman, my friend, I like him. He's a bright and able fellow. But that's the message we're sending. And it's a bad message. And if federal employees, I will tell you, I represent 62,000 federal employees. And I tell all of them and all the unions, if they're not performing their job, if they're watching television 4 hours a day, they ought to be fired. And I will support the gentleman in that effort. Because we ought to demand performance. And that's why we have in the IRS code, you can take the salary if they're not paying their taxes. That's not true of any other employee in America. You've got to go through a legal process, et cetera, as you should. So I would urge my colleagues to defeat this bill, as we did in the last Congress on suspension. And yes, tell all of our employees, you need to pay your taxes. And make sure if they don't, IRS gets their fees. And if they're not performing their task and it undermines their performance, then we ought to subject them, just as every other employee, to being removed. But not simply to say arbitrarily, this employee, these employees, our employees, America's employees, will be treated more harshly than the American people and the American workers around this country are treated. Treat them the same. That's fair. That's what they hope for. We shut down government for 16 days, sent our employees home. The gentleman from North Carolina talked about there are some bad circumstances for some people. They got to pay a mortgage payment or a rent payment or a car payment or a college tuition. And we sent them home and we said, we're not paying you. And we came back later and we said, no, we're going to pay you. But we caused them a great deal of angst. I will tell you this, that's not the way to treat people. And we didn't send them home because we didn't have the money to pay for them. We didn't send them home because America was bankrupt. We sent them home because we disagreed with the policy the president was pursuing. Or we wanted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, over which they had no control. But we sent them home without pay. And very frankly, those who were critical employees, we kept working, but we didn't pay them. What way is that to run any organization, much less the greatest country on the face of the earth? I urge my colleagues, show respect and fairness to those who work for our country in the civil service of our country. Reject this legislation. Vote no. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields